Session 560. Deleted. Good evening. Now, a few remarks directed to my friend and yours. First of all, Robert has, as you know, an excellent intellect. It is not as well developed, however, as he supposes. He could do far more with it. Now, he emphasizes its strictly analytical nature, and in so doing, puts limitations upon the ways in which he uses it. He does not allow it the freedom that he should or set it to work for him as completely as he could. Often, when he most believes he is being analytically intellectual, he is instead using the intellect in a surface manner to cover rationalizations. He has, as you know, excellent intuitive abilities. In the past, in his poetry, the intuitive abilities were somewhat isolated. The truths that came through could be considered as creative fantasies, and therefore did not have to be accepted literally or accepted by the intellect. The intuitive portions of himself he has always considered as feminine. The intellectual capacities he always considered masculine. He relied upon the intellectual abilities therefore as the stronger, because in his own background he believed the male to have the greater strength. Some of this has to do with the cultural climate that colored his attitudes. He puts his intuitions in as intellectual terms as possible. To his way of thinking, this gives them greater acceptability, strength, and durability. He will not be laughed at as a result. One of the reasons why he did not understand that the spontaneous intuitive self was the deeply creative and therefore deeply stable self was that he identified it with his idea of femininity, as he unfortunately misunderstood it. It was therefore second best, undependable, and could lead to by ways that were not respectable. He never equated money with respectability or prestige. As a youngster, he had no family background or money, and his need to be looked up to and held in esteem could not wait. He set himself up then as an intellectual, and this became his badge of respectability. It also held a more masculine than feminine image in his mind, however, for the reasons as given. He could not deny the intuitive self, so it became the self who wrote poetry. In his environment, this, however, was an intellectual thing to do. The feminine image meant instability, intuitions that could lead into unrespectable byways, and emotions that were not intellectually restrained. You, being a male, he felt, would be most alarmed at any undue emotionalisms. This aside from your own reaction to your mother's emotionalism. So, there was a good division set up between his intellectual, respectable to him masculine aspects, and his intuitive, feminine, private aspects. The psychic work meant that these would be united. There was strength, as could have been expected. Intuitively, and as a woman he would naturally have longer hair, wear earrings and jewelry, which fits the inner feminine image, and also the inner mystical, psychic image of the series, the prophetess, and in your own relationship, the mistress. in appearing on television. He wore initially the pantsuit to stress the masculine aspects, or tailored clothes, each stressing to him the more masculine, intellectual, respectable qualities of his nature. He is saying, "You see, I am quite normal, quite intellectual, and in my way, quite responsible and proper. Do not be alarmed by my wild mystical self, for it is well under control." He feels also that this image suits your ideas, as indeed it does to a large degree. This also has something to do with your private lives, for the feminine portions of that nature can quite easily be frightened into not showing themselves through the mounting function that is so oddly spontaneous, so mysterious to the intellect, and the one-man sign by which the female monthly shows her difference from the male. Now, to some extent, when that began, you are created. For while you were adventurous, you also to some extent feared the spontaneous nature that was so a part of your wife, in those terms. A small, somewhat amusing note. Whenever throughout your marriage, you commented adversely when Rupert was about to throw a scarf about his neck, or perhaps wear an extra chain with others, he interpreted this, and quite correctly, as a hint of caution on your part, that he was giving too much prevalence to the feminine love of ornamentation. Now, in his restrained motion, he has to some extent adopted what he feels to be the more proper, deliberate, responsible characteristics connected in his mind with the symbolical masculine. Analytical intellectual. He is saying, "I do not run off half-cocked. I am not feminine, mystical, wild, given to fancies that will take you far from the world you know into unknown territory. I am not the unpredictable and therefore unreliable prophetess or mistress. My slow and deliberate movements should tell you this. They tell me this, and offer me then that security." Thus, he interprets these emotions to himself. They are saying to you, "Once I made you leave your hometown and your parents out of my erected season, I will not irresponsibly lead you into realities that you cannot trust." He was afraid that as once he felt he dragged you all over the country, you would fear that he was now dragging you all over the inner universe. The symptoms have therefore been an attempt to equalize an inner situation. Now, they have grown less as he understood the inner situation. The male characteristics he always thought of as stabilizing. The intellect and the tailored clothes went together. The quick motions were always associated with inner intuitive feminine abilities. The symptoms have in part been meant to reassure you that you need not be afraid that he would be driven by his impulses. In the beginning of the psychic work, you were concerned at spontaneous stations, and while you were highly intrigued by the developments, there was one situation in particular that frightened you both. The time that Rupert ended up on the floor when he picked up the information from your neighbor, Barbara. You gave him quite a lecture, but it was nothing like the lecture he gave himself, and it rearoused old fears of giving in spontaneously to impressions or psychic data. He considered this dangerous. he began to watch out that such episodes would not reoccur, and this was reflected in muscular tenseness. The test went in strain, and your own, precipitated a situation in which his intellect was constantly checking his intuitive information. Because of his own background, this precipitated a situation in which one portion of the self was constantly scrutinizing another portion with a jaundiced eye. Now, you may rest your fingers for a moment, but we are going to get all of this information through that we can. Now, without the psychic development, your combined background could have quite undermined your creative abilities entirely. This was a chance you took, both of you, when you set up this last reincarnational existence. You had used creative abilities often in the past. This time, you had several problems, both of you, to deal with. If the psychic abilities showed themselves, then this would be your last reincarnation. If not then, there would have been others, and you knew this. To some extent, illness has been used by you both in a constructive manner. On your part, Ram noted, RFB. They said, initially as a very definite warning, that you were not to put your full energies into a job. Pressure from your parents could have precipitated such an arrangement. Your illness was then used by Ruber to bring to the surface of his mind deeply rooted fears that had been festering beneath. Your illness served this purpose for you also. This further led to a recognition of the basic useless of many of the ideas upon which your existence had been based, and upon which your society was based. This triggered the need to find newer answers and to probe into other dimensions. The very experience, however, with all of its charms and insights, had to bring to the foreground personal problems of development that many people simply do not face or come to grips with. Strain and tensions developed, but in grappling with these and with the physical symptoms, new insights were reached. The relative exile of Ruber's symbolically feminine characteristics is something that neither of you consciously realized. You did this to assure yourselves that these abilities, feminine in both of your minds, would not so get the upper hand that the responsible and in both of your minds, masculine or dependable aspects of your life would be frightened. All of the time, of course, these feminine aspects were being used as the intuitive, mystical thresholds of psychic activity. I told you once that Ruber would not have allowed a feminine counterpart of myself to speak, but neither would you have. You would have been afraid of the unpredictable in quotes feminine aspects. Now, all of this is highly important. To some extent, it was inevitable, considering your backgrounds. The feminine aspects in any case, culturally speaking, were being denied since you did not want children. Reincarnationally, this you said ahead of time. If the psychic developments that represented your greatest fulfillment, with all their ramifications in your art and life, had not occurred, then you would have had 2 children, and continued a reincarnational cycle. There are other aspects here, in that in your last reincarnational life, you had somewhat greater freedom within the sexual framework. You can come closer to the ideal identity that gives greater range within one individual to both male and female characteristics. When the sexual identity is sound, as it is in both of your cases, this means the need for a greater accommodation within the self, a tolerant attitude, an exuberance and freedom, so that the best qualities of each sex can be harmoniously blended, while the personality still retains its necessary overall one-sex identification physically. So, all in all, with the problems, you have managed well. This fits in with your own artistic nature and with your background in this life. You also identified your creative with female characteristics or abilities, symbolically speaking, and this has something to do with your distrust of making money with your art. In your mind, making money is a male characteristic and subconsciously a male prerogative. The fact that you painted and it did not seem to bring you money served further to make you distrust these creative abilities. You identified them to some extent with your mother, the first female, of course, in your background. She was unpredictable, and so you felt you could not depend upon your art, nor count upon it as a man. Now, that is the main reason why you have not tried to make a living as an artist per se. You have been convinced that it would never work, even as you could not imagine depending upon your mother for a livelihood. This certainty that you could really never support yourself as a fine artist derives its strength from that identification, and in the main from that identification alone. Now, commercial work and the comics meant something else again. It was not fine art, but directed outward in obvious fashions in an aggressive sort of thrust, with a particular market in mind, and therefore to you had a masculine quality. You were perfectly free to support yourself in your early years in that way, and your energy was released because in that regard you felt free to use it. When the natural freely creative energies were aroused in you, you instantly dispensed with all ideas of a commercial market, and completely devote the idea of painting from selling for the reasons given. The fallacy that neither of you recognized was that the creative, symbolically feminine portions of the self were not unpredictable, given to over-emotionalism. They are instead the secure, propelling, and only dependable fountainheads of existence. You could see Ruber's errors in this respect to some extent, but you could not see your own. Your feelings that helped feed Ruber's own misconceptions. You also felt safe when he did not move so fast, when his slower mobility seemed to denote greater deliberation, when in other words, he did not let himself go. Now, rest your fingers. I will leave Ruber as he is. I will have him let this one in. Now, as noted, much of this has to do with the fact that in your last reincarnation, both the masculine and the feminine aspects of personality are to be as fully experienced as possible, while the overall present one-sex identification is to be maintained. This permits the fullest expression of true identity that is possible within the physical system. Otherwise, identity is smothered to a large degree beneath a strictly oriented one-sex identification, with other characteristics masked and denied expression. You are allowing the longer hair is a sign that of late, You have become less frightened of the symbolically creative and feminine aspects of the artist. Your refusal in the past to look the part of an artist, per se, reflected your determination to insist upon, to you, the contrasting masculine aspects. As you allowed yourself somewhat more freedom in this regard, you both saw to it that in compensation, Robert in his appearance allowed himself less. All of this stems, again, from your misconception of the nature of the creative self. Now, logically, it may not be stable in intellectual terms, for it knows that one and one do not always give you two. But its great stability lies in its flexibility, its intuitions, and in its unending source of creativity. In your relationship, as a couple, then, you set up a framework in which freedoms allowed to one were compensated until certain adjustments were made. The creative aspects were given so much leeway until out of fear, one of you applied restraints of a restrictive nature. The painting to you had such strongly feminine connotations that subconsciously you felt your studio was like a womb, out of which the paintings were produced. You felt that this had some terrifying implications, many of them frightening your sense of masculinity since, because of your misconceptions, you were convinced ahead of time that they would never be used as a means of livelihood. Robert, on the other hand, felt he could use psychic books as a means of livelihood. For in the books, at least, he felt the masculine and female tendencies merge, the intellect making use of the intuitive information. In withholding his parents, he also felt he lessened the pressure upon you, for he gave up the biological badge of femininity and was saying, "You will never have to have a full-time job to support a child." He knew full well that you didn't feel you would ever make a living as a fine artist. The monthly periods unconsciously served as a constant frighten by reminding you each of his femininity and ability to bear a child. Now, do you have questions? Ralph noted. I pointed to a painting I had just finished, of a male looking up and to my left. It had a strong appeal for me, and was almost a monochrome, done in blues and greens. I felt it had some sort of reincarnational meaning for me, but hadn't yet got around to using the pendulum to see what I could find out on my own. Ralph asked, "Can you say anything about that painting?" They said, "I can indeed." Now, in your paintings, many of them, you merge the male and female characteristics. The feminine compassion and the intuition often appearing as it does here in a male face. You do not paint the faces of females as a rule, because of the ideas of which I have just told you. Whenever you show the so-called feminine qualities of insight or compassion, you show them as appearing in the male profile, where they are seen opaquely and not faced full-on. You feel they need the male discipline to give them a suitable framework, and to define them. Without this, you feel them frightening. This also has something to do with your feelings toward oils, under certain conditions. Ralph noted, in trance, Jane pointed to the new painting. They said, "The picture is of a man, or rather of a woman who lived in Constantinople in the 14th century. A mystic of some renown who was well known for looking into the future. Ianodiala. Rob noted, spelled. They said, "It's the nearest I can come in translation for the name. You painted her as a male for the reasons given. Do you have other questions?" Rob noted. I shook my head no. Actually, I had several about the new painting, but my writing hand was so cramped, I felt I wouldn't be able to continue using it much longer. They said, "We will then end our session. You will find that I have given you a good deal of information this evening that you should be able to put to excellent use in your daily life. Now, my heartiest good wishes to you both, and a fun good evening." Rob said, "Good evening, Seth, and thank you very much. I am sure it will all be very useful." Seth said, "I certainly hope so." Rob noted, "Actually, I already regarded this as a breakthrough session. In personal terms, probably the best Jane has given.